our universalist theology carries a promise. The promise is that you are loved, that you are known and loved for who you are, and that every person around you is known and loved. Now, you already know how rarely this promise is truly lived in the course of human history. But today I want to tell you a story about a community of people who were not told that they were loved, that were told that they were unlovable. And yet how that community discovered that they could love and be loved. In short, they discovered in a radical act of solidarity and resistance that love is what defines and shapes the world. Now, this story is the story, unsurprisingly, given that this is Pride Month. It's the story of the Stonewall Inn riots. Now, I first learned about the Stonewall Inn when I was walking as a young elementary school kid with my brother and mother in Greenwich Village, and they pointed out this inn and said, that was where the gay rights movement happened. But they hadn't told me much about what gay rights were and why those rights were so important or hard won. And so I didn't understand this story until I studied it from the perspective of a historian. I love historical stories because they contain so much truth about who we are. To understand the power of this story, you have to understand what things were like leading up to the Stonewall Inn riots in 1969. In 1969, 49 states made it illegal to have any homosexual activity. Every state except Illinois. Now, this just wasn't one of those laws on the books that state governments hadn't gotten time around to taking off. No, this was a law that was enforced through policing and courts and culture. For instance, if you were arrested for a homosexual act, for kissing someone of your own sex, for instance, then what would happen is the next day in your local paper, your name, your address, and your arresting crime were listed in the paper. Now, this wasn't just an act of shaming merely. Employers and state agencies would actively check this list. And if you were on it, you had a high chance of facing a lifetime of unemployment. See, stories like this help us recognize how injustice has impact on real lives. Homophobia wasn't just policed. It was reinforced in many cultural ways. For instance, in the 1960s, it wouldn't be unusual if you were watching TV for a public service announcement to come up featuring a narrative that you as a parent had to be on guard because because one of the things you needed to fear was an older adult man approaching your son and showing that child inappropriate sexual images. The message was you needed to be on guard and watchful for anyone you suspected as gay at any time. This message was taught early and often. We have this footage of a Miami-Dade police officer going to speak to an auditorium full of middle schoolers. And his message was this: I know that many of you students will someday try some homosexual activity. I want to make it clear to you that you will be caught, exposed, and shamed. You will be caught, exposed, and shamed. No matter how much you achieve or how successful you are, you will be caught, exposed, and shamed. In addition to the desire to love another person, even and maybe even because that they share your sex or gender, there were other penalties besides criminal prosecution. There were medical treatments that members of the LGBTQ community were forced to undergo. And I'm not even talking about the conversion therapy that is still present in many of our states and harms and sometimes even causes the taking of life. No, I'm talking about things, treatments like electroshock therapy, castration, sterilization, and a lobotomy. Words that, because of how unnecessary and they were, I believe, are torture. In this context, because the risks of meeting someone, of going to meet someone, of holding their hand, of kissing, of sex were so high that people who were looking for that kind of contact would often have to go into public and transitory places, places that they would have an excuse to be in anyway, places like parks and public bathrooms and subway systems. Now, none of these places, except maybe sometimes the park, screams romance. They're not the places that you invite intimacy or longer conversations. In fact, people there might find some touch, but it was harder to find connection. Yet it was all that some members of these communities were left with. The exception to this, actually, were bars. There were some bars that were willing to specifically cater to the LGBTQ community. And at least in New York City, they were often run by the mafia. Yep, that's right, the mafia. The mafia had no trouble earning money from this specific clientele. What they would often do is take some kind of cheap alcohol anyway, water it down and sell it for twice as much. See, the mafia never has problems with making money like that. This is kind of a great example of us recognizing that those who are most vulnerable are also the most at risk at being taken advantage of. Now, something else was happening specifically in 1969. John Lindsay was running for re-election as mayor in New York City. And as part of his campaign tactic that is all too familiar with us, he said he would clean up the city. He would try to rid it of indecent activities. And he said, specifically, he'd look at 42nd Street, which was a hub at the time for XXX movies and prostitution, and Greenwich Village. So that was a clear code for everyone who knew that this mayor-elect or mayor who's going for re-election was going to be targeting the LGBTQ community. Now, Stonewall, even given all that context, almost didn't happen. In fact, there were other raids on bars that, or taverns that were not that dissimilar from Stonewall. In fact, the checkerboard had been targeted by a police raid just the week before. But there were a few things that were different in this particular case. Now, most of the time, it's good to mention again that police raids were quite normative for LGBTQ establishments. But the mafia, not wanting these raids to disrupt business, would often pay the police to get a tip that they were coming, or pay them another kind of amount of money to schedule the raid to come at, say, 4 p.m. on a Monday afternoon when their establishment was quite empty. The other thing that was unusual was that the Stonewall Inn wasn't just another bar. It was a kind of watering hole on the savannah. It wasn't at all like the kind of buttoned up bars on the Upper East Side where the clientele would have a nice glass of wine or maybe some bourbon over conversation. No, this was a place where people came, and they came from all different walks of life. Some were professionals, some were homeless youth who were kicked out of their homes or left because of the level of anxiety they had living with family members who were rejecting them. Some of them came because they were cross-dressers or transvestites, or who like to dress and drag, and that sort of gender pushing was not acceptable even then among normal gays and lesbians who were seeking to gain safety by conforming. No, the thing that united the patrons of that establishment, the Stonewall Inn, were that they had nothing to lose. They knew that they were only holding on by a thread. And so they came Black, white, and Hispanic in equal numbers. And there they were, kind of this little beloved community, sticking together, celebrating together, drinking together, sharing joys and sorrows alike. When, on June 28th, 1969, in the wee morning hours, right around 1:20 a.m. in the morning on Saturday, Friday night into Saturday, these 6 police officers decided to raid the Stonewall Inn, this most famous of the gay establishments. And I will tell you, it was packed. It was packed. And so when these police officers came in and flicked on the lights and started to move people to the back, they were shocked. A drag queen was having her 18th birthday party in a back room, and just more and more people came in. And the police officer said, "You're going to show us your IDs, and we're going to go and put you in the paddy wagon." The patrons that day were angrier than normal to have their celebrations disrupted. But something else was happening just a few meters away. See, it was a busy night, and some of the people just passing by could tell something was happening at the Stonewall Inn, and so they began to gather. And as the patrons were leaving the Stonewall Inn, normally you would see them kind of hide away, cover their face, try not to have their photo taken because, again, exposure came with such real risks. But instead, seeing that interested, watchful crowd giving witness to this moment, some of the patrons who came out, instead of hiding away, raised the victory symbol, raised the V symbol. And they knew what this meant. Many of them had been part of the civil rights movement, the women's movement. They had been marching against Vietnam. And so they understood what a power sign this was. And the crowd got excited. One drag queen who had been arrested broke free from the police line and began running down the street. The police officers chased her and beat her with clubs. The crowd responded with anger and began to heckle the police and throw pennies at them, insult them and mock them. The crowd became invested. They began to show an ethic of public care towards these community members. Some of the community members who were trying to distract and heckle the police so that way the patrons could escape began to engage in some unusual tactics. Some of them began to form a chorus line. It included some drag queens, but also just some regular people. They put their arms around each other and began to go, "We are the village girls. We wear our hair in curls. We roll our dungarees above our Nelly knees." The cops just didn't know what to do. But this is such a wonderful example that in times of heartache, in moments when you're scared, sometimes a little humor and creativity will get you through. Now, the police seeing this hostile crowd, which now had grown substantially large, knew that they were in danger because this crowd was angry. They were angry at the relentless harassment at the hands of police. And so the arresting police officers, the 6 of them, actually barricaded themselves within the Stonewall Inn, along with the people that they were trying to arrest. They put furniture against the doors, and they tried to block out the windows, and they could hear the rocks being thrown at the windows, the angry shouts. In fact, some people on the street got some lighter fluid and actually set fires to the door and trying to break in. 4 drag queens, at least, and I know Queen Orlando was there and Congo Woman. They used all the muscles that they had, and I don't even quite know how this is possible, but they ripped a parking meter out of the cement and used it as a battering ram to try to break into the Stonewall Inn and to get the patrons out of there and to get those police officers. The police officer in charge, who was inside, understood this moment clearly. Officer Pine went to each one of his officers and he said, "Do not pull your gun and do not shoot. Do not pull your gun and do not shoot." Now, the riots had grown so big that the local precinct, who hadn't even been alerted of this raid, sent in a large contingency of cops in riot gears, and they would push back against the crowd in front of the Stonewall Inn, who would retreat and circle around, and they push back again, and on it went till the early morning hours when the street was left with broken glass and shards and trash, and the signs of the revolt of the revolution were on the streets. The police broke into the Stonewall Inn and ripped the upholstery and broke all the liquor bottles and broke the jukebox that the patrons loved to slow dance to. But the mob, being the mob, cleaned up the inn and had it ready for business the next day. And I will tell you, the next day's crowds in solidarity, furious at police support, just grew. For 6 more nights, the crowds gathered, looking to claim space and voice. Now, some of the leaders of the LGBTQ community gathered in amazement. They finally saw their coming out moment, their liberation moment, like they had seen some of their siblings, women and African Americans have already. And they said, how can we change this from a moment to a movement? Now, one of the people there, Martha Shelley, she was a lesbian woman who had participated in the Freedom School movement and also in women's rights marches, said that they needed to be out. They needed to be visible and they needed to march. Her suggestion was unanimously adopted by the group. And so a few days after they had planned this march, to march from Christopher Street, which was just about a block away from the Stonewall Inn, up 6th Avenue, all the way till Central Park. And so in the morning of this march for gay liberation, about 120 men gathered. And they began to move. And as they looked up 6th Avenue, they saw that some of their friends had come out and they could see their friends stretched as far as 14th Street. And 14th Street is the traditional dividing line in Manhattan between downtown and midtown. And they began to march up 14th Street, but they began to speed up. In fact, they were kind of running because each of them had received death threats, harassment, other threats against their bodies and person, and they thought the chance of completing this walk was really small to none. In fact, they just wanted to cover as much ground as possible before being taken down. And so there they were, adrenaline and fear working together, when just past 14th Street, they looked back. They looked back and they saw that they were no longer a crowd of 120 men. They were a crowd of 2,000. 2,000 people gathered together in this movement. And they realized in a way they had never experienced before. And they thought, we are a people. We have a people. And so with tears just streaming down their face, they walked to Central Park. And when they got there, they just hugged each other and celebrated and let that moment sink in. It's a little funny because, you know, like a typical march, they had promised some speakers, but they literally thought they would never make it to Central Park, so they had planned nothing. Instead, they just experienced the beloved community. We both commemorate and reenact that march every year in the Pride Parade. So is Pride a protest or a party? Yes, of course. Of course it is both. My spiritual companions, I share this story of history with you today so we could learn again with some specifics what we already know, which is such stories both tell us how far we've come and still how much further we have to go, and give some strategies and storytelling and hope to bring us along. We need to do this work, not only in our larger world, but at UUCA. So I hope that you'll keep a lookout for those learning opportunities, workshop sessions that will help us become more inclusive. I appreciate this story for so many reasons. I appreciate how it reminds us of how unjust laws and cultural practices impact and sometimes determine people's literal lives. In Maryland, we're doing pretty well when it comes to living the promise of inclusion, when it comes to the laws that we have on the books. There are still a few more things to do, and we're going to put up in the chat a link to a website that shows what important work is still left undone for our citizens here in Maryland. And no matter the marks that we get on paper, I hope you witnessed, as I did last Sunday, when we heard from our coming of age youth, both the pride and the heartache that they expressed in their voices, in their words, in their bodies, in their expressions about what it means to be an LGBTQ youth today. It's not just a story of joy. It's a story of being unabashedly proud and fearful. It's our opportunity to speak to our youth and all the youth in this state to say, we are your people. We will show up to help you be safe. We will be the reminder that you are visible and loved. I also love this story of the Stonewall Inn because it begins with ethnic diversity. It breaks down this false myth that we have white, straight people over here and Black church people over there. It's not as simple as that. Have you ever visited the Black Lives Matter official website, the national one? I really recommend it. There's a tab that says, what are we about? And on it, it says, we are about queer folk, we are about trans folk, we're about disabled folk. They practice a radical inclusivity. They practice living at the intersections of identities because people don't fall just into one thing. In fact, Alicia Garza, who was the woman whose Facebook post sparked the hashtag Black Lives Matter, is herself a queer Black woman who is married to a biracial trans woman. The story is never simple, and the fight for inclusion is never just a single fight. The Black Lives Matter founders practiced inclusion and beloved community. And every time we fight for Black Lives Matter, we owe it to them to practice the same level of inclusion and intersectionality. I love this story because it is a story about police harassment, police targeting. This is a story about the LGBT community who was so angry at the police, and it reached a boiling point. And I want to remind you, 4 years ago, when the Pulse nightclub in Orlando was attacked by an angry man who shot down Blacks and whites and Hispanics who were dancing together in this gay nightclub, that the police responded to try to protect that community. When the police arrived, they were welcomed in. And the patron said, "Thank you for coming." This is a reminder that progress can happen and relationships can change. We need that reminder. I want to remind us that this wouldn't have happened if it had not been a community willing to show up, willing to witness, and willing to push for change. Remember that the most important word in theology is with. So let us be with one another. Let us show up for one another. Let us remember that we're a people of a deep faith tradition, a tradition that calls us to recognize the inherent worth of each and every person, that calls us to recognize the inherent wholeness of each and every person, and to love with that level of clarity. We do this by responding to the concerns of the LGBT community and also showing up equally to celebrate with them. We share joy as well as sorrow. Together, may we sing for our lives and sing for the lives of all our loved ones. May it be so, and amen.